A pregnant widow stands on an auction block in the burning sun. Her 10-year-old son is in front of her with his fists clenched. Her 7-year-old daughter hasn't spoken in 4 months. The auctioneer hits her across the face, and 40 men watch in silence. No one bids. No one wants a woman with 2 kids and a baby on the way. Then a voice from the back of the crowd says 2 words, $20. A stranger just bought her whole family. She doesn't know his name. She doesn't know why. All she knows is the most dangerous man in town was watching her from the front row. And he didn't bid. Not because he didn't want her, because he already has a plan. As the wagon pulls away, she leans toward the man who just saved her and whispers, "You'll regret this." He doesn't even turn around. He just says, "I've regretted every day of my life for the past 3 years. One more won't make a difference." What she doesn't know yet is that he's hiding something just as dark as she is. And the man in the front row? He knows exactly who she really is. You're listening to Wild West Stories channel, where every trail leads to a tale worth telling. If your heart beats for frontier grit, love forged in dust and fire, and the untamed spirit of the Old West, then saddle up. You're riding with the right crew. This story teaches us that redemption doesn't come from erasing the past. It comes from choosing to stay when everything inside you screams to run, and that the strongest families aren't built by blood. They're built by broken people who decide to hold on to each other anyway. If that intro gave you chills, smash that like button and tell me in the comments. Would you have trusted the stranger with $20? Share this story with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe with the bell on so you never miss a ride into the Wild West.
The sound Abigail Thornton would remember for the rest of her life was not the auctioneer's voice, nor the laughter of the crowd, nor even the crack of his hand across her face. It was the silence that came after. When 40 men looked at her and her children, and not a single one of them said, "Stop." The wooden platform smelled of horse sweat and old tobacco. Abby could feel the planks burning through the thin soles of her shoes, heated by the midday sun that hung over Bitter Creek, Wyoming territory, like a punishment from God. Spring of 1874, and the whole town had turned out for the quarterly debt auction the way decent folk might turn out for a church social. Except nobody was decent here, not today. Her son, Jack, stood in front of her like a fence post driven into hard ground. 10 years old and already wearing the face of a man twice his age. His fists were balled at his sides, knuckles white, jaw clenched so tight Abby could see the muscle jumping beneath his sunburned skin. He had positioned himself between his mother and the crowd the moment they climbed the steps, and nothing short of God Almighty was going to move him. Behind Abby, pressed into the folds of her threadbare calico skirt, 7-year-old Emma had not made a sound. She had not made many sounds at all in the 4 months since they buried her father in the frozen ground outside the mining camp at Copper Ridge. The girl communicated now through touch and movement. The tightening of small fingers, the press of a forehead against a hip bone, the silent trembling that said everything words could not. The baby kicked hard beneath Abby's ribs. 7 months along, her belly straining against the worn fabric of the only dress she owned. She placed her hand there, feeling the movement, and thought the cruelest thing she had ever thought in her life. "I am sorry you are coming into this world, little one. I am so sorry." The auctioneer was a man named Silas Greer. He was not cruel in the way Abby had expected. He was something worse. He was bored. He called out lot numbers and descriptions the way he might rattle off the price of feed corn, his voice flat and mechanical, his eyes scanning the crowd without really seeing the human beings he was selling. This was Tuesday. This was his job. There was nothing personal in it, and that absence of feeling was more devastating than any deliberate malice. 2 women had gone before Abby. The first was a widow named Clara Haskins who had wept so hard she could barely stand. She went for $8 to a sheep rancher who needed someone to card wool. The second was a young woman Abby did not know, barely 20, who had laughed through the entire proceeding. A high, bright, terrible laugh that had nothing to do with humor. That woman had lost her mind somewhere between the poorhouse and the auction block, and nobody seemed to notice or care. She went for $14 to a man whose eyes made Abby's stomach turn. Abby watched both women leave the platform. She made herself a promise. She would do neither. She would not weep, and she would not break. She would stand straight and look these men in the eye and make them see a human being, even if it killed her. "Next lot," Silas Greer announced, consulting his ledger. Abigail Thornton, age 29, widowed 4 months, 2 children, boy aged 10, girl aged 7. He looked up from the book and gestured at her belly without expression. "And as you can see, gentlemen, there is a third on the way. Current debts include burial costs for one Samuel Thornton, back rent on county housing and medical fees. Total outstanding, $18.40. The crowd shifted. Men in dusty work clothes and sweat-stained hats glanced at each other with the calculations of livestock buyers. How much work could she do? How soon before the baby came and made her useless? How much would the children eat versus what they could produce? Abby kept her eyes forward. The wind picked up and carried dust across the platform, stinging her cheeks. Somewhere behind the crowd, a horse stamped and blew through its nose, the sound of chains clinking from a nearby wagon, the ordinary sounds of a town going about its business while human beings were sold in its square. "Do I hear $10 to start?" Silas called out. "Nothing." The silence spread like water across the platform, seeping into every crack. Abby could hear her own heartbeat, could hear Jack breathing hard through his nose, could hear Emma's small, hitched exhale against her hip. $5, then. Do I hear 5? Nothing. Not a hand raised. Not a voice. Just 40 men looking at a pregnant widow and her 2 thin children and deciding they were not worth the price of a saddle blanket. $2, a voice called from somewhere in the middle of the crowd. The voice was thick with mockery and cheap whiskey. And she better know how to cook. Laughter rippled through the square. Abby felt heat flood her neck and face. Jack made a sound deep in his chest, almost a growl, and she put her hand on his shoulder hard enough to hurt. "Do not," she whispered. "Do not give them that." "I will take the boy for $2.50, another voice drawled. "But just the boy. He can work off what the woman owes. She and the girl can go to the county home." "No." The word tore from Abby before she could catch it. "We stay together. My children stay with me." Silas Greer moved faster than she expected. The back of his hand caught her across the cheekbone, a sharp, practiced blow that snapped her head to the side and sent a shower of sparks across her vision. Emma screamed, a thin, piercing sound that cut through the laughter like a blade. Jack lunged forward, but Abby caught him, wrapped her arms around him, held him against her even as her face burned and her ear rang and the taste of copper filled her mouth. "You do not speak," Silas said, his voice the same flat monotone as before. "You understand? You are the lot. The lot does not speak." Abby straightened. She tasted blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. She nodded once and said nothing. But her eyes found a face in the crowd and locked onto it, and what she saw there turned her blood to ice. Frank Dalton stood in the front row. He was not bidding. He was smiling. He was a tall man, well-dressed by Bitter Creek standards, with a silver watch chain across his vest and boots that had been polished that morning. His face was the kind of face that belonged on a daguerreotype in a bank lobby. Respectable, prosperous, patient. He stood with his arms folded and watched Abby the way a cat watches a mouse that has not yet realized the exits are blocked. And in that smile, Abby read something that stopped her heart. Recognition. Dalton leaned toward the man beside him. Abby could not hear the words over the noise of the crowd, but she read his lips well enough to catch 2 of them. "That is her." Her knees nearly buckled. 10 years. She had run for 10 years, changed her name, buried 1 husband, carried 3 children, crossed half a continent. And it had not been enough. They had found her. The bidding stalled at $2.50. Silas was losing patience. He wiped sweat from his forehead and tried again. "Come now, gentlemen. The boy alone is worth $3 in labor. You are getting a bargain. $20. The voice came from the back of the crowd. It was quiet. Not loud, not dramatic, not trying to make a point. Just a statement of fact, the way a man might say the word rain when he saw clouds building on the horizon. The crowd went silent. Heads turned. Bodies shifted to create a gap. And through that gap stepped a man Abby had never seen up close but recognized from the edges of town life the way you recognize a distant mountain. Always there, never approached. Nathaniel Carson was tall and lean in the way of men who work harder than they eat. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but she could see the lines carved deep around his mouth and the gray threading through dark hair that needed cutting. His clothes were clean but worn past any pretense of newness. His boots were scuffed to the color of dust. He walked through the crowd slowly, and people moved aside for him without being asked, the way water parts around a stone. "What was that?" Silas said, his eyebrows climbing. "What did you say, Mr. Carson?" "I said $20, for all of them. The woman, the boy, the girl, and the child when it comes." The square erupted in whispers. $20 was more than any lot had brought all day. More than most brought all year. Silas looked like a man who had just found gold in his pocket. "Well now, $20 from Nathaniel Carson. Do I hear 25? Silence. The men who had been jeering and mocking moments ago were suddenly fascinated by their boots, by the sky, by anything that was not the auction platform. Nobody wanted to bid against Nathaniel Carson. Abby did not know why, but she could see it in the way they would not meet his eyes, something between respect and caution. 20 going once, 20 going twice. The gavel cracked. Sold to Nathaniel Carson for $20. Abby's legs went weak. She gripped Jack's shoulder to steady herself and felt Emma's arms tighten around her waist. The crowd began to break apart, the show over, men drifting toward the saloon or the livery or wherever they went when they had finished watching lives get auctioned away. She climbed down from the platform, one hand on her belly, the other holding Emma's fingers. Jack jumped down ahead of them and planted himself at the bottom of the steps, scanning the dispersing crowd like a guard dog. And there was Frank Dalton, blocking her path. He tipped his hat. The gesture was flawless, gentlemanly, the kind of courtesy that costs nothing and means less. He leaned close enough that only she could hear, and his voice was silk over a blade. "Your father sends his regards, Miss Whitfield." Then he straightened, smiled that patient smile, and walked away into the crowd as casually as if he had just commented on the weather. Abby could not breathe. The world tilted sideways and she gripped Jack's arm to keep from falling. The auction platform, the laughing crowd, the crack of Silas Greer's hand across her face. None of it had shaken her the way those 6 words did. "Your father sends his regards, Miss Whitfield." He knew. Dalton knew. And if Dalton knew, then her father knew where she was. And if her father knew, then everything she had built in 10 years of running was already over. She walked to the wagon on legs that felt like water. Nathaniel Carson was there, checking the harness on his horses. He did not look at her, did not offer a hand, did not say a word of welcome or comfort or explanation for why he had just spent $20 he almost certainly could not afford. She helped the children up into the wagon bed, then hauled herself onto the seat beside him, her pregnant belly making the movement graceless. He still had not looked at her. Abby leaned close. She needed him to understand what he had just done. Not the kindness of it, if kindness was even the right word. The danger. "You will regret this," she whispered. Nathaniel Carson did not turn around. "Maybe," he said, his voice dry as the Wyoming wind, "but I have regretted every day of my life for the past 3 years. One more will not make a difference." He snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, and Abby sat rigid beside this stranger who now held claim to her labor and her children's lives, while behind them the most dangerous man in Bitter Creek watched them go with the patience of a rattlesnake waiting in shade. The wagon creaked and swayed down the main street. Every window held a face, every doorway held a whisper. Abby kept her chin up and her eyes forward because pride was the only currency she had left, and she would spend it carefully. In the wagon bed, Jack sat with his arm around Emma, both of them silent, both of them watching the town shrink behind them. The prairie opened ahead, vast and gold-green and indifferent to the small human dramas playing out at its edge. Abby did not look back. She had learned long ago that looking back was just another way of standing still. But her hand found her belly, where the baby turned and kicked, and she made a second promise. Whatever comes, she thought, we survive it. Same as always. We survive. Nathaniel Carson's ranch looked the way a man looks when he has stopped bothering to shave. Not dead, just done trying. Abby saw it from the top of the ridge, the wagon cresting the final hill after an hour of silent travel. A cabin sat in a clearing of beaten dirt and overgrown grass, listing slightly to the east as if the wind had been pushing it in that direction for years, and the cabin had simply decided to stop resisting. One window had a crack running corner to corner. The porch steps dipped in the middle where the boards had softened with age and rain. The garden patch beside the cabin was more weeds than soil. But the barn was different. The barn stood straight, its doors hung true, its walls recently patched with new lumber that had not yet weathered to gray. A neat row of tools hung along the outside wall. The corral fence was mended with fresh wire. That told Abby everything she needed to know before Nathaniel Carson said a single word. He lived in the barn. The cabin was where his wife had died, and he had left it to decay the way a man leaves a grave. The barn was where he actually existed. She filed this information away the way she filed everything. Quietly. Carefully. Information was protection, and protection was survival. He pulled the wagon up in front of the cabin and set the brake without ceremony. The horses blew and stamped, eager to be free of the harness. From somewhere behind the barn came the clucking of chickens, and farther out the distant low of cattle. Nate climbed down and stood for a moment, looking at the cabin as if seeing it through her eyes. His jaw tightened. "It is not much," he said. "It is a roof," Abby replied. She did not add what she was thinking, which was that after 4 months in the county poorhouse, sleeping on a floor with 23 other bodies, a leaning cabin in the middle of nowhere looked like a palace. He moved to help her down, and for the first time his hand touched hers. His fingers were rough, calloused, the knuckles scarred with the kind of marks that come from years of working wire and wood. But they trembled, a fine, constant tremor that he could not quite hide. Abby noticed, but said nothing. Jack vaulted over the wagon side before anyone could offer assistance. He landed on his feet and immediately put himself between his mother and the cabin door, scanning the property with those 2 old eyes. Emma climbed down slowly, her small hand gripping the wagon rail, and pressed herself against Abby's side the moment her feet touched ground. "Inside," Nate said. He was already walking toward the barn, his back to them. "There is a lock on the cabin door. Use it." "Mr. Carson," Abby called after him. He stopped but did not turn around. "I need to know what you expect from this arrangement." He was quiet long enough that the wind filled the silence, pushing through the tall grass with a sound like breathing. Then he said, "I expect you to work. Cook, clean, tend the garden. The boy can help with the stock and the fencing. The girl can help you in the house, and at night." Now he turned. His eyes were gray, the color of river stones, and they met hers for the first time with an expression she could not immediately read. Something like exhaustion, something like anger, something underneath both that she was not ready to name. "You sleep in the cabin with your children. I sleep in the barn. The lock is for your side of the door." Abby blinked. She had prepared herself for many answers. That was not one of them. "I did not buy you for that," he said, and his voice had gone hard, almost sharp. "I bought you because you needed buying and those children needed saving, and I—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "Do not read more into it than that." He turned and walked to the barn, and the door swung shut behind him, and Abby stood in the yard with her children and a cabin she had not asked for, and a benefactor she did not understand. Inside the cabin was a museum of neglect. One room, maybe 15 feet square. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a rough wooden table with two mismatched chairs, a narrow bed frame in the corner holding a mattress that had gone flat with years of emptiness. Dust thick enough to write in covered every surface. Cobwebs hung from the rafters like old lace. But it was the small things that made Abby's throat tighten. A woman's hairbrush on the shelf above the wash basin, still holding strands of blonde hair. A jar of dried wildflowers on the windowsill. The blooms crumbled to brown dust. A blue gingham curtain, faded almost white, hanging crooked from a bent nail. Emily Carson's things, still here, still waiting for a woman who would never come back for them. "Mama," Jack said quietly. He was standing by the table, running his finger through the dust. "I know, baby. We have work to do." They worked until the light faded. Jack brought firewood. Emma swept the floor with a broom whose bristles had worn to stubs. Abby scrubbed the table and the shelves and the fireplace stones until her hands were raw and her back screamed with every movement. It was while scrubbing the inside of the kitchen cabinet that she found the marks, scratched into the wood on the back of the cabinet door. Rows and rows of tiny lines grouped in fives the way you might count days. Some were carved deep, gouged into the grain with force. Others were faint, barely visible, as if the hand that made them had been too tired or too hopeful to press hard. Hundreds of marks, organized in groups that started strong and trailed off, then started again, then trailed off again. Abby ran her finger along them, and a chill crawled up her spine. What had Emily Carson been counting? She closed the cabinet door and did not mention it to the children. That evening, Nate returned carrying a sack of flour and a smaller bag of dried beans. He set them on the table without looking around the cabin, though Abby knew he could see the changes. The swept floor, the cleared shelves, the fire crackling in the hearth for the first time in what must have been years. "This should keep a while," he said, "if you are careful with it." "Thank you." He nodded. His eyes moved to the fireplace and stayed there. The flames reflected in them, and for a moment his face was unguarded, and Abby saw something she recognized. He was remembering. This room, this fire, this table, but with someone else. "My wife kept it better," he said. Before she died." He did not say the words. He did not need to. "How long?" Abby asked. 3 years. 3 years, 2 months, 17 days. He said it the way you say a number you have counted too many times to forget. "I am sorry," Abby said. "Do not be. Everyone dies." He turned and left. The door closed. And from the cabin window, Abby watched him cross the yard to the barn, his gait slow and heavy, a man carrying weight that had nothing to do with flour or beans. She fed the children by the fire. Thin soup again, the same as every night for months, but warm and in their own bowls at their own table, and that made it better than anything the poor house had offered. Emma ate 2 helpings and almost smiled. Jack ate like a soldier, fast and efficient, always listening for sounds outside. They made beds on the floor with blankets from a trunk in the corner. Abby took the mattress, not from selfishness, but because her pregnant body could not take another night on bare ground. She lay in the dark, one hand on her belly, listening to her children breathe. From the barn, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of glass clinking against glass. Then silence. Then the sound of a grown man crying, muffled by hay and distance and shame. Abby pressed her hand against the cabin door and held it there for a long time, listening to a stranger grieve, wondering what kind of house she had walked into, and what kind of ghost still lived in its walls. By the 3rd morning, Abby noticed that Nate never ate breakfast. Not because he was saving food, because his hands shook too badly to hold a spoon. She watched him through the cabin window as he crossed from the barn to the corral, his fingers fumbling with the gate latch, his shoulders rigid with the effort of controlling a tremor that seemed to worsen with each passing hour. He moved like a man balancing on a wire, every gesture deliberate, every step measured, as if the ground itself could not quite be trusted. She had seen this before. In the mining camps, men who drank themselves half to death and then tried to stop. The shaking hands, the sweat that came even in cold weather, the way their eyes went hard and glassy when the craving hit. Nathaniel Carson was not grieving his wife, or rather, he was. But that was not all he was doing. He was fighting something else, something that lived in the bottle she had heard clinking in the barn that first night. She said nothing about it. Not yet. Information was protection, and she was still gathering. The first week found its rhythm the way water finds a channel. Not smoothly, not willingly, but inevitably carving a path through resistance until the days began to flow in a pattern that almost resembled life. Nate took Jack out to the fence line on the second morning. The boy went willingly enough, though Abby could see the stiffness in his spine, the way he kept 3 feet of distance between himself and this stranger at all times. Like he was ready to bolt. She watched them from the garden, where she knelt in the dirt, turning soil with a rusted spade, her belly making the work awkward and painful. Emma was beside her, wordless as always, planting seeds in the shallow furrows, with a precision that was almost mechanical. Push the seed into the soil, cover it, smooth the dirt, move to the next spot. A 7-year-old girl doing the work of planting, because the work of speaking had become too hard. Abby paused and watched her daughter's small hands press the earth. Emma's fingernails were still dirty from the poor house, still ragged from being bitten down to nothing during the long nights on the floor. But her movements were steady, capable. She was doing something that mattered, and even in silence Abby could see that it helped. "Good girl," Abby whispered. "That is exactly right." Emma did not look up, but her shoulders relaxed a fraction, and she moved to the next furrow with something that might have been purpose. At the fence line, Jack was learning what wire could do to unprotected hands. Abby heard a sharp cry and looked up to see the boy clutching his fingers, blood welling from a cut across his palm. Nate did not rush to him, did not fuss. He pulled a strip of cloth from his back pocket, wrapped Jack's hand with quick efficiency, and said, "Now you know what the wire feels like. It will not surprise you next time." Jack stared at him with an expression balanced perfectly between resentment and respect. He did not thank Nate. But he picked up the wire again and went back to work. And when Abby looked 20 minutes later, they were working side by side in the kind of silence that men share when words would only get in the way. That evening, Nate ate at the cabin table for the first time. Abby had made soup from the dried beans, stretched thin with water and seasoned with wild onions Emma had found growing behind the privy. There was cornbread baked in the cast-iron skillet she had scrubbed clean that morning. It was not much. It was more than they had had in months. Nate ate the way a man eats when he has forgotten that food can be anything other than fuel. Fast, mechanical, barely chewing. His eyes stayed on his bowl. His hands, wrapped around the spoon, still trembled, but less than that morning. When he finished, he looked up and his gaze moved slowly around the table. Jack eating with careful posture, imitating the straight-backed way Nate sat. Emma with her face down, spooning soup with silent concentration, the fire crackling in the hearth, the lamp throwing warm light across surfaces that had been dark for years. "Table sounds different with people at it," he said, to no one in particular. Then he stood, placed his bowl in the wash basin, and left for the barn without another word. Jack watched him go. "Who was his wife?" he asked Abby. "A woman named Emily. She died of fever. He loved her." It was not a question, and Abby did not treat it as one. "Yes," she said, "he did." Jack was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is he going to love us too?" It was such a raw question, so naked and hopeful and frightened all at once, that Abby had to turn away and pretend to tend the fire so her son would not see her face. "I do not know, baby," she said when she could trust her voice. "But he is giving us a chance." That is more than anyone else has done." Jack nodded and went to help Emma clean the bowls. He was careful with his bandaged hand, and when Emma reached for a bowl that was too high on the shelf, he lifted it down for her without being asked. And for a moment they were just children, brother and sister, doing chores by lamplight. Not survivors, not refugees, just kids. Abby stood by the fire and pressed her hand to her belly and whispered, "You see that? Those are your people. And whatever else happens, that does not change." The next afternoon, while Nate and Jack were riding the north pasture checking on a section of fence that had come loose in the wind, Jack noticed something. They had dismounted to work on a post that had rotted through at the base. Nate was digging around the foundation with a shovel, his sleeves pushed up past his elbows, and Jack, holding the new post steady, found himself staring at Nate's wrists. Both of them bore scars. Not the random marks of ranch work, not the nicks and scrapes that came from handling wire and tools. These were deep, uniform, circling both wrists like bracelets made of damaged skin. Rope burns, old ones healed white and smooth, but unmistakable. Jack knew what rope burns looked like. He had seen them on the wrists of men brought back from Indian raids. He had seen them on prisoners hauled into camp by soldiers during the last gasps of the border wars. He did not ask. He was 10 years old and already wise enough to know that some questions were not questions at all, but doors, and once you opened them, you could not always close them again. He filed the information away the way his mother had taught him, quietly, carefully, and he went back to holding the post. Nate glanced at him, saw the boy's eyes flick away from his wrists, said nothing. They finished the post in silence and rode back to the cabin with the late afternoon sun turning the prairie gold. 3 days after their arrival, Abby was hanging blankets on the line to air in the sun when she heard hoofbeats approaching from the east. She dried her hands on her skirt and shielded her eyes against the glare, and what she saw made her stomach drop. 3 riders. The one in front was young, late 20s, with a face like a closed fist. Hard jaw, flat eyes, a body that moved on horseback with the easy confidence of a man who had spent more of his life in a saddle than out of one. He wore a pistol on his right hip and a badge she did not recognize on his vest, Cole Braddock. Abby did not know his name yet, but she knew his type. Every mining camp, every frontier town, every place where power needed enforcement had a man like this. A man who did the ugly work that the men in suits preferred to keep at arm's length. He pulled up in front of the cabin and tipped his hat with a mockery of courtesy. "Morning, ma'am. Cole Braddock, representing Mr. Dalton's interests, here to inspect the collateral property." "Mr. Carson is not here," Abby said. She kept her voice level and her hands at her sides, though her heart was hammering. "This is his property. You can come back when he is available." Cole smiled. It was the smile of a man who enjoys making people uncomfortable. "Now, see, ma'am, mister. Dalton's mortgage papers give him the right to inspect this property any time he sees fit. I do not need Mr. Carson's permission for that. I just need his land." He dismounted without waiting for an invitation, and his 2 men followed. They spread out across the property with the deliberate thoroughness of men who had done this before. One went to the barn, the other walked the fence line. Cole himself wandered the yard, counting chickens, checking the well, peering through the cabin window. But his real focus was Abby. She could feel it, the way you feel a hand hovering near your skin without touching. He studied her face while pretending to study the property. He asked casual questions. "Where are you from originally, Mrs. Thornton? How long were you in the poorhouse? You have family back east." Abby gave him nothing. 1-word answers and silence. She had been interrogated by better men than Cole Braddock, but as he mounted up to leave, she saw something that sent ice through her veins. He pulled a small notebook from his vest pocket and sketched something in it with quick, practiced strokes. She caught a glimpse before he closed it. A face. Her face. He was making a portrait, for identification, for someone who was paying to have her found. After the riders disappeared down the trail, Abby found Nate in the barn. He was sitting on his cot, the bottle of rye whiskey in his hand, not drinking, just holding it, staring at it the way a man stares at a loaded gun he's trying to decide about. When he heard her step, he shoved the bottle under his cot and stood up too quickly, and they both pretended she had not seen what she had seen. "Dalton sent men," she said. "Cole Braddock and 2 others. They searched the property." Nate's jaw tightened. "That is his right under the mortgage terms." "Nate," he was drawing my face, "in a notebook. He is not interested in your cattle or your fence posts. He is interested in me." Nate looked at her for a long moment. His gray eyes were steady, but beneath the steadiness she could see calculations running, decisions being weighed. Then he said, "I know." 2 words. They landed like stones in still water, and the ripples spread outward into silence. "You know what?" Abby said carefully. "I know that Dalton is not just after this ranch. I know that he's looking for you specifically. And I know that whatever name you gave at the auction is not the one you were born with." The barn went very quiet. Outside, the wind pushed through the grass with its endless breathing sound, and a horse shifted weight in the corral, and the world continued as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. "How long have you known?" Abby whispered. "Since before the auction." "I was in the saloon 6 weeks ago. Dalton was talking to Cole, did not know I was in the back. Heard them going on about a merchant's runaway daughter from St. Louis and a $500 reward. When I saw you on that block and watched the way Dalton looked at you without bidding, I put it together." Abby's legs felt like they might give out. She leaned against the barn wall and pressed her hands flat against the wood. "So you did not buy me out of charity. No, you bought me to keep me from Dalton. I bought you because anything Dalton wants that badly I want to keep from him. He has taken everything else in this county. He took land from ranchers who could not pay. He took women from that auction and nobody knows where half of them ended up. He was not going to take you." Abby stared at him. The lamplight caught the angles of his face, the deep lines around his mouth, the shadows under his eyes. He looked exhausted in a way that sleep could not fix. "So, I am a chess piece," she said. Her voice was flat. "You were a chess piece on that auction block, too. At least on my board, nobody hits you." It was not a comforting answer. It was not meant to be. It was honest and imperfect and slightly mercenary, and Abby realized with a start that she trusted it more than she would have trusted kindness. Kindness could be a mask. Self-interest was at least legible. She went back to the cabin and checked on the children. They were asleep, Jack on the floor with his blanket pulled to his chin, Emma curled beside him like a cat. Abby stood over them and felt the weight of everything she was carrying. Then she went to the kitchen cabinet and opened the door. The tally mark stared back at her, row after row of scratches in the wood. And this time, in the light of what Nate had told her, she saw them differently. Not a prisoner counting days, a wife counting hope. Emily Carson had been marking the days her husband stayed sober. The long rows were the good stretches. 20 marks, 30. One row that ran to what looked like 47 before it stopped. The short rows were the relapses. 2 days, 3. Sometimes just one lonely mark before the count started over. A wife's silent record of love and heartbreak, scratched into the back of a cabinet door where nobody could see it but her. Abby closed the cabinet and leaned her forehead against the wood. What kind of man have I tied my life to, she thought. A drunk, a fighter, a man who buys women at auction to spite his enemies, and cries alone in barns, and counts his dead wife's memory in years and months and days. But also a man who told her the truth when a lie would have been kinder. A man who gave her a lock for the door and slept in a barn. A man whose hands trembled with the effort of not reaching for a bottle. She did not know yet what to make of Nathaniel Carson. But she was beginning to think that whatever he was at least real, and real, in her experience, was worth more than good. That night, after the children were asleep and the cabin was quiet, she heard Nate's voice from the barn, low, barely audible through the walls. "There is something else," he said. She must have gone to him, though she did not remember deciding to. She stood in the barn doorway, and he sat on his cot with his hands hanging between his knees. Dalton did not just hear about you from a letter, he said, not meeting her eyes. Somebody in this town wrote to your father first. Somebody who knew who you were before you ever stepped onto that auction block. Abby's blood went cold. Who? She asked. That is what I have been trying to figure out for 6 weeks, and I am running out of time. The wind howled outside, rattling the barn walls, and neither of them spoke for a long while. Somewhere in the foothills, a coyote cried out, long and lonely, and nothing answered back. Bitter Creek's main street was 200 yards of packed dirt, 6 buildings that mattered, and 40 windows behind which somebody was always watching. Abby had avoided the town since the auction. 3 weeks of keeping to the ranch, keeping her head down, keeping her world small enough to control. But now she was entering her 8th month, and there were things she needed that the ranch could not provide. Medical supplies, cloth for swaddling, a tincture for the pain in her back that had gone from an ache to a grinding, constant fire. Margaret Pritchard had promised to come by with supplies, but Margaret's husband had taken sick with a stomach ailment and she could not leave the store. The message came by way of a ranch hand passing through, and Abby read between the lines. Margaret could not come because Margaret was afraid. Not of sickness, but of Dalton, who had eyes everywhere and would notice if the store owner's wife made regular trips to the Carson ranch. Nate objected to her going. He stood in the barn doorway with his arms folded and his jaw set and said, "Town is not safe for you right now. Town has never been safe for me. But I need supplies, and they are not going to walk out here on their own. I will go. You make a list. You cannot buy what I need. You do not know what I need. I am having a baby, Nate, not building a fence. Different supplies." He stared at her, his gray eyes hard with something she was learning to recognize as fear disguised as stubbornness. She stared back. Neither blinked. Finally, he said, "Take the rifle. Keep it under the wagon seat." She took the rifle. She also took Jack because she needed his eyes, and because he needed to see the town through something other than the memory of the auction block. Emma stayed at the ranch with Nate, a decision that surprised Abby as much as it surprised Nate. Emma had simply refused to get in the wagon, planting herself on the porch step with her arms around the calico barn cat and shaking her head. It was the most decisive thing the child had done in months, and Abby chose to see it as a good sign. Emma trusted Nate enough to stay. That was something. The ride to town took 45 minutes. The prairie rolled around them in every direction, huge and indifferent, the grass beginning to thicken with the promise of summer. Hawks circled overhead. A jackrabbit bolted from a stand of sagebrush, and Jack tracked it with his eyes the way Nate had taught him to track movement, steady and patient. "You scared, Mama?" Jack asked. Abby considered lying. "No," she said. "I am not scared. I am angry. There is a difference. What are you angry about? That I have to feel anything at all about walking into a town to buy cloth and medicine? That is what I'm angry about." Jack nodded. He understood. He had been angry about things like that for most of his short life. They reached Bitter Creek just before noon. The main street stretched before them, baking in the sun. The general store at one end, the saloon at the other. Between them, a feedlot, a livery stable, a land office that doubled as Dalton's bank, and a church with a steeple that leaned slightly east as if trying to distance itself from the saloon. Abby tied the wagon in front of Doc Werner's pharmacy and helped Jack down. The moment her feet touched the street, she felt it. The watching. Windows that went dark as she passed. A woman on the boardwalk who turned her back and walked inside. 2 men at the livery who stopped talking mid-sentence and watched her with flat, curious eyes. This is what they do, Abby told herself. They look at you and see the auction block. They see the pregnant belly, and the dirty children, and the shame. Let them look. Give them nothing. She walked with her back straight and her eyes forward, Jack beside her matching her stride. Doc Werner was a thin man in his 60s with wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that smelled of camphor. He sold her what she needed without comment, wrapping the parcels in brown paper and tying them with string. When he handed them across the counter, he met her eyes and said, "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Carson." It was the first time anyone in Bitter Creek had called her by Nate's name. It was such a small thing. It should not have mattered, but it did. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it for more than the supplies. From the pharmacy, she walked to the general store because she needed thread and a length of muslin, and because Margaret Pritchard was the closest thing she had to an ally in this town. She did not expect Frank Dalton to be there. He was standing at the counter when she walked in, examining a display of pocket watches under glass. He wore a dark suit, a pressed white shirt, and an expression of pleasant surprise that was so perfectly calibrated it could only have been practiced. "Why, Mrs. Carson," he said, straightening. "What a fine surprise. I was just telling Henry here that his wife makes the best coffee in the territory. Will you sit and have a cup with me?" Abby's heart hammered. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and walk out. But running was what Dalton expected. Running was what running had always been. The thing that made her weak. The thing that confirmed she had something to hide. She stayed. "That is kind of you, Mr. Dalton, but I have errands to finish. Surely you can spare a moment." Dalton's smile was warm, his eyes cold. He pulled out a chair at the small table near the window where Margaret kept a coffee service for customers. He gestured for her to sit the way a man gestures for a woman he considers his property. Abby sat. She placed her parcels on the table and folded her hands over her belly and looked Frank Dalton in the eye and gave him absolutely nothing. He was good. She had to give him that. He asked about the ranch with the easy familiarity of a neighbor making small talk. How was the spring planting going? Were the cattle healthy? Did Nate have enough hands for the branding season? Every question innocent on its surface and loaded underneath. Then he leaned back and said casually, "I have been corresponding with some business associates back east, St. Louis way. Wonderful city. You ever been to St. Louis, Mrs. Carson?" Under the table, Abby's nails dug into her palms hard enough to draw blood. "No," she said, "I have not had the pleasure." "Pity? Beautiful town. Lot of successful merchants there. Good families. The kind of families that take care of their own, no matter how far they wander." He watched her face the way a man watches a card game, looking for the tell, the flinch, the flicker of recognition that would confirm what he already knew. Abby gave him stone. She had been practicing stone for 10 years. "Well," she said, standing, "thank you for the conversation, Mr. Dalton. I should be getting back. Of course. Give Nate my regards." He tipped his hat, and she walked out into the sunlight on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Jack was waiting by the wagon, his face tight with worry. "What happened?" "You look sick." "I am fine. Let us go." She was climbing onto the wagon seat when a voice called from behind. "Mrs. Carson, a moment, please." She turned. Reverend James Wheeler stood on the church steps, a thin, anxious-looking man with a face carved by guilt and too many sleepless nights. He hurried toward her, carrying a small parcel wrapped in cloth. "Margaret asked me to give you this," he said, pressing it into her hands. His eyes darted up and down the street as if checking for watchers. "She said you would understand." Abby unwrapped the parcel on the wagon seat as Jack drove them out of town. Inside was a folded newspaper from St. Louis, 3 months old. She almost set it aside, thinking Margaret had sent it for the sewing patterns on the back page, the way frontier women sometimes shared newspapers for their practical value. Then she saw the notice on page 4. Small type. Easy to miss unless you were looking for it. Cornelius Whitfield, prominent St. Louis merchant, seeks information regarding his daughter, Abigail Whitfield, missing since 1864. Substantial reward offered. Contact F. Dalton, Bitter Creek, Wyoming Territory. Abby read it twice, 3 times. The words swam and reformed, and each time they said the same thing. Her father had put her name in a newspaper, her real name. Connected to this town. Connected to Dalton. Every drifter, every opportunist, Every man with a horse and a need for reward money between here and the Missouri River now knew where to find Abigail Whitfield. She had thought Dalton was her only problem. She was wrong. Dalton was just the gatekeeper. Behind him was an open door, and through that door would come anyone desperate enough or greedy enough to chase $500. "Jack," she said. Her voice was calm, but her hands were shaking. "Drive faster." They made the ranch in 30 minutes instead of 45. Nate was mending the corral gate. His sleeves rolled to his elbows, sweat darkening his collar. He looked up when the wagon came in too fast, saw her face, and set down his hammer. She dismounted and handed him the newspaper without a word. He read it, standing in the sun, and she watched his expression travel. Confusion to understanding, to something harder and colder than she had ever seen on his face. Like a door slamming shut and being bolted from the inside. "He put it in the paper," Nate said quietly. "Yes. Then every drifter and bounty hunter between here and Missouri knows where you are." "Yes." Nate folded the paper and looked at her with eyes that had gone the color of storm clouds. "Then we had better stop pretending this is just about a ranch," he said. The wind picked up. Somewhere, a gate hinge creaked. And Abby stood in the yard of a borrowed home and realized that for the first time in 10 years, running was no longer an option. Not at 8 months pregnant, not with 2 children and a baby coming, not with her name printed in black ink for the whole territory to read. She was going to have to stand and fight. The only question was whether she would still be standing when it was over. They sat across the kitchen table with a kerosene lamp between them, and 10 years of lies stacked higher than the flame. The children were asleep. Jack on his pallet by the fireplace, one hand curled near the spot where Nate kept a rifle by the door. Emma beside him, small and still, the calico cat tucked against her chest. Hope. That was what Abby had started calling the baby in her mind, though she had not said it aloud. Hope. A name for a child who did not exist yet, but who kicked and turned and insisted on coming regardless of how little the world wanted her. The fire had burned down to embers. The cabin was dark except for the lamp, which threw their shadows huge and wavering against the walls. Outside, the wind pushed against the windows with its constant, restless pressure, and the cottonwood trees along the creek made a sound like whispered arguments. Nate sat with his hands wrapped around a tin cup of cold coffee. He had not drunk from it. He was using it the way Abby had seen him use many things, as something to hold on to. "All right," he said. "Let us have it." Abby looked at him across the table and made a decision that went against every instinct she had cultivated since she was 19 years old and running for her life. She decided to tell the truth. "My name is not Thornton," she said. "It is not even Abigail, not really. My mother named me Abigail, but my father called me by my middle name, which is Ruth. My family name is Whitfield. My father is Cornelius Whitfield. He owns a trading company in St. Louis that deals in cotton, fur, and railroad contracts. He is very wealthy and very powerful, and he has been looking for me for 10 years. Nate did not react. His face stayed still, his gray eyes steady on hers. He already knew most of this, she realized. But knowing and hearing were different things, and she watched him absorb the words the way dry ground absorbs rain, slowly, with cracks. "Why did you run?" he asked. She told him. She told him about Hardin Shaw, her father's business partner, a man of 55 with a dead first wife and a reputation for cruelty that everyone in St. Louis society knew about and nobody discussed. She told him about the arranged marriage, how her father had presented it as a fait accompli, a business merger sealed with his daughter's body. She told him about the night before the wedding, how she had gone to Shaw's house to deliver her father's wedding gift, how she had heard sounds from the servants' quarters and gone to look, how she had found Shaw standing over the body of a household servant named Thomas, a young man of maybe 20, whose skull Shaw had caved in with a fireplace poker during a drunken rage. She told him about running to her father, about the words Cornelius Whitfield had spoken, the words that had ended her childhood, and her name and her life in St. Louis all at once. He said, These things happen in business, Ruth. Shaw is a valuable partner. You will marry him as planned, and you will not speak of this again. She told him about packing a bag that night, about walking out the back door of the Whitfield house on Chestnut Street, about buying a train ticket west with the household money her mother had hidden in a hat box, about changing her name in Kansas City and marrying Samuel Thornton, a miner she barely knew because a woman traveling alone on the frontier was a target and a woman with a husband was invisible. She told him she had no evidence, no letters, no documents, no witnesses, only her word against the word of two of the most prominent men in St. Louis. I did not run because I was brave, she said. I ran because I was too afraid to stay, because I knew that if I stayed and kept quiet, I would become something I could not live with, and because I knew that if I stayed and spoke up, my father would make sure I was never heard. The lamp flickered between them. Nate had not moved. His coffee had gone cold enough that the surface had stopped steaming. You have nothing, he said. No proof. Nothing but my memory and a dead man's name. Then it is your word against theirs. It has always been my word against theirs. That is why I ran. Silence. The fire popped in the hearth. Emma murmured in her sleep, and the cat stretched against her. Nate set down his cup and looked at it for a long time. I owe you the same, he said. You do not owe me anything. Yes, I do. You gave me the ugliest thing you own. Now I am going to give you mine. He told her about Emily. Not the version the town knew. The pretty version where a man's wife died of fever and he was left alone to grieve. The real version. The one he had never spoken aloud. She took sick on a Tuesday, he said. Started with chills and sweating. By Thursday, she could not get out of bed. I rode into town for the doctor, but the doctor was already tending 3 other families. Whole county was sick that winter. He gave me laudanum and told me to keep her cool and pray. His voice was flat, stripped of emotion, the way a man speaks when the emotions are too big to carry in words. I stayed with her through Friday and Saturday. But on Sunday morning, she seemed better. She ate some broth, talked about the garden she wanted to plant in spring. I thought the worst was past. He paused. His hands tightened around the cup. So I went to town, told myself I was going for more laudanum. But the saloon was between the pharmacy and the livery, and I had not had a drink in 14 days, and Emily was getting better, and I thought, one. Just one to take the edge off. His voice cracked. He did not try to repair it. I woke up on the saloon floor at dawn. The bartender was kicking my boots, telling me to get out. I rode home so fast the horse was lathered. The cabin door was open. The fire had gone out. Emily was in bed. He stopped. She was cold, he said. She had been dead for hours. The bed was soaked through. She had sweated through the sheets and the mattress. She had tried to get to the door. Her hand was reaching. Her mouth was open. Abby pressed her hand to her own mouth and held it there. The neighbors told me later they heard her calling my name most of the night, calling and calling. But nobody came because everybody was afraid of the fever. And I was not there because I was drunk on a saloon floor while my wife died alone, calling for me. The lamp was the only sound in the cabin. That and the wind endlessly pushing at the walls. The tally marks, Abby said softly. Nate nodded. She counted the days. Every stretch of sobriety I managed, she scratched it into the wood, like she was keeping score. Like if she could see the numbers getting longer, it meant things were getting better. The longest run was 47 days. I know because I counted them after she died. He looked at Abby, and his eyes were wet, but no tears fell. Men like Nate did not let tears fall. They held them behind the dam of their jaw and their pride and their grinding, relentless guilt. That is why I sleep in the barn, he said. I cannot sleep in the bed where she died, reaching for the door. I cannot look at that cabinet without seeing her scratches. I cannot be in this cabin without hearing her voice. He pushed back from the table. That is what you are dealing with, Abby. A drunk who let his wife die alone. A man who bought you at auction not because he is good, but because he owed God a life and yours was cheaper than Emily's. That is the truth. All of it. Do with it what you will. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that changes the shape of a room. Abby sat in it and felt the weight of two confessions pressing down on the table between them, and she thought about mirrors. His guilt and her fear were the same thing seen from different angles. He failed someone by being absent. She survived by running. Neither of them knew how to stay. Then Nate said something that broke the quiet like a stone through glass. Maybe your father was right to want to lock you away. You do not know how to trust anyone, because you do not know how to be worth trusting. The words hit Abby in the chest like a fist. She felt them land, felt the breath go out of her, felt the immediate and total silence that followed. Nate's face went white. He knew what he had done the moment the words left his mouth. She could see it in the way his jaw went slack, the way his hands went still on the table. Abby did not cry. She did not shout. She picked up the small blanket she had been sewing for the baby, folded it with precise, controlled movements, and walked out the cabin door into the dark. She sat on the porch step and looked at the stars and breathed. In and out. In and out. The way she had breathed through contractions with Jack. The way she had breathed through Samuel's funeral. The way she had breathed through the auction block. Pain was something you processed, not something you surrendered to. An hour passed. Maybe more. The stars wheeled overhead, cold and indifferent and beautiful. She heard the cabin door open, heard bootsteps on the porch boards, felt more than saw Nate lower himself onto the step beside her, leaving a careful distance between their bodies. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "Emily used to look at me the way you just did, right before she would stop talking to me for a week." Abby said nothing. "I do not want you to stop talking to me," Nate said. "Then do not give me a reason to." Another silence. But this one was different. This one had given it. A fraction of space where something destroyed might, with enough time and care, begin to grow back. "Dalton is going to come for you," Nate said eventually. "Not for the ranch. For you. The reward money, your father's reach, whatever hold he thinks he will have. It is coming. I know. I will not let him take you. You might not be able to stop him. Then I will slow him down long enough for you to run." Abby turned to look at him in the darkness. His profile was a shadow against the starfield, strong jaw, broken nose, the hat he never seemed to take off even after sundown. A man who had just told her the worst thing he had ever done, and who had followed it with the cruelest thing he had ever said, and who was now offering to stand between her and danger as if both of those things could exist in the same person. They could. She was learning that they could. "I am done running, Nate," she said. "Then God help us both." From somewhere in the foothills, a coyote howled, long and lonesome and unanswered. They sat on the porch and listened to it fade, two people who had no right to trust each other and no choice but to try. Cole Braddock came back on a Tuesday with 2 men, 2 guns, and a piece of paper that smelled like trouble dressed up in legal language. Abby saw them from the garden. 3 riders coming down the ridge trail at a pace that was not hurried, but was not leisurely either. The pace of men on business. She straightened from the row of beans she had been weeding, one hand pressing against her aching back, the other shielding her eyes from the morning sun. "Jack," she called. Her voice was steady. "Get inside and stay with Emma. Do not come out until I tell you." Jack looked at the riders, then at his mother, and his face did that thing where the child disappeared and the soldier took over. He went inside. Abby heard the bar drop into place on the cabin door. She wiped her hands on her skirt and walked to the center of the yard, positioning herself between the approaching riders and the cabin, and waited. Cole pulled up 10 feet in front of her and swung down from his horse with the loose-limbed ease of a man who spent his life moving between saddle and ground. His 2 companions stayed mounted, flanking him like bookends. One had a rifle across his lap. The other had a hand resting on his pistol grip. "Mrs. Carson," Cole said. tipping his hat. "Got some paperwork here from Mr. Dalton that needs attending to." He held out a folded document. Abby took it, opened it, and read it where she stood while Cole and his men watched. The document was typed on heavy paper and bore a stamp that was meant to look official. "Property Reclamation Order," it said across the top. "Pursuant to Section 12 of the Bitter Creek Mortgage Code, the below-named property holder is hereby ordered to vacate the premises within 48 hours due to material violation of mortgage terms." Abby read it through twice. Then she read it a third time, this time not for the content, but for the details. The county name was spelled wrong, using the old territorial designation instead of the current one. The date format used a style that no Wyoming territorial court had adopted, and the signature line at the bottom, where a magistrate's name should have been, held a stamp so blurry it could have said anything. It was a forgery, a good one. Good enough to fool most frontier ranchers who could barely read their own names. But not good enough to fool a woman who had grown up watching her father draft contracts in a St. Louis office. Nate emerged from the barn. He had his rifle in one hand and his hat pulled low, and he walked with the measured stride of a man who knows that speed invites trouble but wants trouble to know he is ready for it. He positioned himself beside Abby, not in front of her. She noticed that. In front would have been protection. Beside was partnership. "What is this?" Nate said, looking at Cole. "Eviction notice," Cole replied. "Mr. Dalton's tired of waiting for his money. You have got 48 hours to clear off this property, or he will send the marshal to do it for you." Nate's jaw tightened. His hands wrapped around the rifle stock were trembling. Not from fear, from the effort of restraint. Cole saw it and smiled. "Heard you have been having some troubles lately, Carson. Shaking hands, bad nerves. Maybe you ought to go back to the bottle, might steady you up some." Nate did not move, but Abby could see the violence building inside him like pressure behind a dam. His knuckles went white on the rifle. The muscle in his jaw jumped. His eyes went dark in a way that made the back of her neck prickle. Cole pushed harder. "Also heard your wife died calling your name while you were passed out in the gutter. That true? Must be hard living out here all alone with that on your conscience. Though I suppose you are not all alone anymore, are you? Dalton's property keeping you warm at night?" Something behind Nate's eyes cracked. Abby saw it happen. A shift from controlled anger to something older and more dangerous. Something that had been born in cannon smoke at Shiloh and had never fully died. She stepped forward before Nate could move. "Mr. Braddock," she said. Her voice cut through the tension like a blade. She held up the document. "May I ask you a question about this paperwork?" Cole blinked, thrown off stride. "What about it?" "This document references the Bitter Creek Mortgage Code, Section 12. But the county name is misspelled." She pointed. "It says Jefferson County. This is Fremont County. Has been since 1871. She turned the page. The date format uses Eastern Convention. Wyoming territorial courts use Western dating since the reorganization of 72. She flipped to the signature line. "And this magistrate's stamp is illegible. No territorial court would accept a reclamation order without a clear, readable judicial signature." She lowered the paper and looked Cole directly in the eye. "This document has no legal authority, Mr. Braddock. It is a forgery. You are currently trespassing on private property with a fraudulent instrument, and if you are not off this land in 5 minutes, I will file a formal complaint with the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne, and Mr. Dalton can explain his signature practices to someone with actual jurisdiction." Cole stared at her. For the first time since she had met him, the easy confidence was gone from his face. In its place was something she had not expected. Surprise? Genuine surprise. He had not been prepared for a pregnant frontier woman to dismantle his legal theater piece by piece. He recovered quickly, but the damage was done. His men shifted in their saddles, glancing at each other with the uncertain expressions of men who had just discovered that the ground beneath them was not as solid as they had been promised. Cole mounted up. He settled into his saddle and looked down at Abby with an expression that was almost incredibly close to respect. But he did not leave quietly. He wheeled his horse and rode it straight through the garden, iron-shod hooves tearing through the bean rows and the tomato plants, and the careful furrows Emma had dug with her small, precise hands. His men followed, kicking down 2 sections of corral fence as they passed, scattering the chickens into squawking panic. They were gone in 60 seconds. Behind them, they left torn plants, broken fence rails, and a message that was louder than any words. "The law might be on your side," the destruction said. "But we have boots and horses, and boots and horses do not care about jurisdiction." Abby stood in the yard and looked at the ruined garden, and felt something collapse inside her that she had been holding up with willpower alone. She had won the battle of words. She had lost the battle of force. And in the real world, in Bitter Creek, Wyoming territory in 1874, force still won. She needed allies. She could not do this alone. Inside the cabin, she found Jack standing behind the window with Nate's rifle braced against his shoulder. His finger was on the trigger guard. His eyes were wide and bright with something that was not quite fear and not quite excitement, but a volatile mixture of both. She took the rifle from him gently. "Jack, look at me." He looked. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, she realized, from how close he had come. He had been sighting down the barrel at Cole Braddock's back. He had been one decision away from pulling the trigger. "Did you think about shooting him?" she asked. Jack nodded. "Once, quick and honest. What stopped you?" "You," he said. "I kept hearing your voice. You said, 'Do not give them that.' At the auction. So I did not." Abby pulled him close and held him and breathed into his hair and thought about what this world was doing to her children. Making soldiers out of boys, making ghosts out of girls, making survivors out of everyone, and asking them to call it living. Behind the cabin, Nate stood alone, staring at the broken fence with the rifle hanging loose in his hand. When she came out, he turned, and his face was still dark with the violence he had barely contained. "Where did you learn to read law?" he asked. Abby met his eyes. "You said no more lies. Then do not lie." She swallowed. "My father was a merchant. He drafted contracts for a living. I grew up watching him work. I can read legal documents the way most women read recipes. It is the one useful thing he gave me." Nate studied her for a long moment, then he nodded slowly, and something in his expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, something more practical. Assessment. "Good," he said. "Because we are going to need that more than we need a rifle." That night, the northern horizon glowed orange. Abby thought it was sunset, until she realized the sun had already set an hour ago. Nate came out of the barn and stood very still, watching the light grow. The wind carried a faint smell, sharp and acrid, the smell of burning grass. "Prairie fire," he said, "and the wind is blowing south toward them." A prairie fire does not kill with flame. It kills with smoke, the thing you cannot see until your lungs are already full of it. Abby learned this in the first 20 minutes. The fire was still a quarter-mile out when the air turned gray and acrid, stinging her eyes, coating her tongue with a taste like burnt metal. The wind had shifted south and was driving the blaze straight toward the ranch, a wall of orange light that stretched across the northern horizon and roared with a sound like a locomotive made of rage. Nate moved with the controlled urgency of a man who had seen fire before. He threw shovels at Jack and Abby and pointed to the line of dirt 20 yards north of the cabin. "Dig," he shouted. "A fire break, 3 feet wide, down to bare soil. Nothing burns if there is nothing to burn." They dug. Abby's back screamed with every shovelful, her pregnant belly pulling at her spine, her arms burning with effort. Jack worked beside her, small and fierce, throwing dirt with the desperate energy of a boy who understood that this was not practice. Emma was in the cabin with orders not to come out. They could hear her through the open window, coughing in the thickening smoke. Nate ran to the corral and threw open the gate. The cattle, already wild-eyed and stamping, bolted south in a thunder of hooves. The chickens scattered. The horses Nate had already saddled and tied to the hitching post behind the barn, ready to run if the fire jumped the break. Then the wind shifted again, and the wall of flame surged forward, and the heat hit them like an open furnace door. Abby could feel it on her face from 200 yards away. The skin on her cheeks tightened and burned. The air shimmered. Embers floated overhead like orange stars, landing on the cabin roof, on the barn, on the dry grass of the yard. Nate climbed onto the cabin roof with a bucket chain from the well, soaking the wooden shingles. Jack ran buckets. Abby ran buckets. Her belly made her slow and awkward, and every trip to the well was a journey through thickening smoke that left her gasping and dizzy. Then Nate stopped. It happened without warning. One moment he was on the roof pouring water, moving with purpose and precision. The next he was sitting on the edge of the roof with his legs dangling and his hands shaking so badly that the bucket slipped from his grip and clattered to the ground. "Nate!" Abby shouted. He did not respond. His eyes had gone glassy, unfocused, staring at the approaching fire but not seeing it. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. His whole body trembled. Abby recognized it. She had seen it in the mining camps, men who had been soldiers, men who heard cannon fire and thunder and saw battlefields in smoke. The prairie fire had triggered something buried deep in Nathaniel Carson's past, some horror from Shiloh or wherever his war had taken him, and it had merged with the smoke and the heat and the memory of another fire, a hearth fire, a fire he should have tended, a fire that went cold while his wife died alone. He was gone. Present in body and absent in mind, lost in a place where the past and the present had become the same terrible thing. Abby climbed the ladder. Her belly made it nearly impossible, every rung a battle against gravity and exhaustion. But she climbed because the roof was on fire in 3 places, and the man who was supposed to save them was sitting in the middle of it, staring at ghosts. She reached the top and crawled to where he sat. Took his face in her hands. His skin was hot, streaked with ash, his eyes wide and empty. She slapped him, hard enough that the sound cracked through the roar of the approaching fire. His head snapped to the side and his eyes blinked once but did not focus. "Wake up," she said, her voice was iron. "Wake up, or your son dies out there alone. Not the boy, not Jack. Your son." The word hit him like a bucket of cold water. Something behind his eyes shifted, refocused, found the present. He looked at Abby, and she watched him come back from wherever he had been, clawing his way up through layers of smoke and memory until he was Nathaniel Carson again, here, now, on a burning roof with a woman who needed him. He grabbed the bucket. They fought the fire for another hour, dug the break wider, soaked the roof until the well ran low, smothered spot fires in the yard with blankets and dirt. Jack worked like a demon, his small body covered in ash and sweat, his bandaged hands black with soot. The fire hit the break and faltered. It tried to jump, sending tongues of flame licking across the bare earth, but the break held. The wind shifted east, pushing the fire away from the cabin and into the open prairie beyond, where it burned itself out against the creek bed. By dawn, it was over. The damage was real but not fatal. Half the pasture was blackened char. The chicken coop was gone, burned to the ground. 3 cows that had not made it out of the north pasture lay dead in the scorched grass. The cabin stood. The barn stood. The family stood. Nate sat on the ground near the well, covered in ash, his hands hanging between his knees. He looked like a man who had been beaten in a fight he barely remembered entering. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face streaked with soot, and something that might have been tears. Emma came out of the cabin. She had spent the entire night inside with the windows shut and the door barred, breathing through a wet cloth the way Abby had told her to. She was pale, coughing, her eyes wide with a fear that had not yet released its grip. She saw Nate sitting on the ground. She walked to him, not running, not tentative, walking with the deliberate steps of a child who has made a decision. She stood in front of him. He looked up. And Emma, who had not spoken more than single words in 4 months, threw her arms around his neck, and said two words that cut through the silence of that burned morning like a bell through fog. "Do not die." 2 words. Clear and steady and fierce. Nate's arms came around her, and he pulled her close, and his face crumbled, and he cried. Not the muffled sobbing she had heard through the barn walls at night. Open, broken crying, the kind that comes when a dam finally gives way, and he held that small girl against his chest and wept into her hair, while the sun rose over the charred prairie, and the last wisps of smoke drifted east. Abby stood on the porch, her hand on her belly, and watched. She thought, this is not pity, this is not obligation, this is family, broken and burned and imperfect, but family. That afternoon, Jack came to her carrying something he had found in the burned grass near the northern fence line, a glass jar, the kind used for kerosene, intact, cap open, sitting in a location where no jar should have been. He set it on the table without a word. They all looked at it. Abby, Nate, Jack. Understanding settling over them like ash. The fire was not an accident. But there was something else. Something that took longer to register. The jar had been placed at the farthest possible point from the cabin. Whoever set the fire had aimed it away from the house, not toward it. They had started the blaze where the wind would carry it through the pasture and the chicken coop, but away from the cabin and the barn. Whoever did this was following orders to burn. But they were trying not to kill. Abby thought of Cole Braddock removing his hat when he saw Emma on the porch step. She thought of the garden he had destroyed, but the cabin he had left standing. And she thought that maybe, in the brutal arithmetic of men like Cole, there were numbers he would not carry. Nate picked up the jar and turned it in his hands. Dalton is not trying to take the ranch anymore, he said. He is trying to drive us out, and when we will not go, he will burn us out. Abby placed her hand flat on the table. Then we stop playing defense. What do you have in mind? I am going to write a letter, not to my father, to Dalton, and I am going to offer him exactly what he wants. Nate stared at her. Myself, she said. I am going to offer him myself. Abigail Carson sat at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning and wrote a letter designed to walk straight into a trap and spring it from the inside. The lamp was low, the wick trimmed to a whisper of flame that threw more shadow than light. The children were asleep. From the barn came the faint sound of Nate moving, the creak of his cot, the restless shifting of a man who could not find peace in the dark. Abby dipped her pen and wrote, Dear Mr. Dalton, I am writing to request a meeting to discuss terms. I understand that you have been in contact with my father, Cornelius Whitfield of St. Louis, regarding my whereabouts. I also understand that my continued presence in Bitter Creek creates difficulties for both you and my husband. I am prepared to discuss an arrangement that would resolve these difficulties to our mutual satisfaction, including the possibility of my voluntary return to St. Louis in exchange for the extension of Nathaniel Carson's mortgage and the dismissal of any outstanding claims against his property. I propose that we meet at the Pritchard General Store this Thursday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I trust you will extend me the courtesy of a private conversation. Respectfully, Abigail Carson. She read it back. The tone was perfectly calibrated. Deferential without being pathetic. Practical without being cold. The letter of a woman who has accepted her defeat and wants only to negotiate the terms of surrender. It was, of course, a lie. The real plan was Margaret's idea, born from a conversation 3 days earlier when Margaret had ridden out to the ranch to assess the fire damage, and found Abby sitting on the porch with a kerosene jar in her hands and murder in her eyes. He will come, Margaret had said after Abby explained the letter she intended to write. Dalton never turns down a meeting he thinks he has already won. He will come to the store and he will sit across from you and he will gloat because that is what men like him do. They cannot resist telling you how smart they are. I know, Abby had said. And while he is gloating, he is going to say things. Things about the money your father sent. Things about what he was paid to do. Things that, if they were heard by the right ears, would constitute an admission of criminal conduct under territorial law. Margaret had leaned forward, her eyes sharp. My husband will be in the storeroom behind the curtain. He will hear everything. He will write it down. And when Dalton leaves, thinking he has won, he will have just handed us the rope to hang him with. It was not enough to destroy Dalton. Abby knew that. An overheard confession was not court testimony. A storekeeper's written account was not evidence. But it was enough to wound him. Enough to make the territorial authorities take notice. Enough, maybe, to buy them time. Time was all they had ever been buying. But before she could send the letter, she had to tell Nate. And telling Nate meant another conversation at the kitchen table. Another truth laid down like a card in a game she was not sure she could win. She told him over breakfast while Jack and Emma were feeding the chickens that had survived the fire. She laid out the plan piece by piece, watching his face darken with each detail. When she finished, he stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. You are 8 months pregnant and you want to walk into a room with the man who has been hunting you for 10 years. I am 8 months pregnant and I am tired of being hunted. This is not a game, Abby. Dalton is not going to sit there and confess because you asked him nicely. He is not going to confess because I asked him nicely. He is going to confess because he thinks he has already won. Men like Dalton cannot help themselves. They need you to know how clever they are. That is their weakness. And if he does not play along, if he sees through it, if he hurts you, then I will deal with it. Nate slammed his hand on the table. I cannot lose another one. Do you understand me? I cannot stand outside another door listening to someone He stopped. The word he had almost said hung in the air between them, unfinished, enormous. Someone you... What? Abby said quietly. He stared at her. His jaw worked. The tremor in his hands was worse than she had ever seen it. He turned and walked out. Hours passed. Abby worked the cabin, mended clothes, nursed the fire, played with Emma in the quiet way that Emma liked, sitting side by side on the porch sorting buttons by color and size. The afternoon wore on, and Nate did not return. By evening, Abby was afraid. She knew where the bottle was. She knew how thin the wire was that held Nathaniel Carson to his sobriety. She had just handed him a reason to snap it. She was about to saddle a horse and go looking for him when Jack appeared in the doorway. His face was tight. I found him, Jack said. Where? The saloon. But Mama, he is not drinking. Abby stared at her son. What do you mean? I mean he is sitting at the bar with a glass of whiskey in front of him and he has not touched it. The bartender says he has been there since noon. Abby closed her eyes. She saw it, clearly as if she were standing there. Nate in the dim light of the Bitter Creek saloon alone at the bar, a glass of rye whiskey sweating on the wood in front of him, full, untouched, the amber liquid catching the lamplight, his hands flat on either side of the glass, trembling, the knuckles white with the effort of not reaching. 3 hours. He had been sitting in front of that glass for 3 hours, fighting the hardest battle of his life, and he was winning. But barely, and alone. Jack, she said, go to him. Jack went. He rode into town on the horse Nate had been teaching him to handle, and he walked into the saloon and he climbed onto the stool beside Nathaniel Carson, and he did not say a word. They sat together for a long time. The bartender, a man named Grady, who had seen enough of human nature to know when not to interfere, polished glasses and said nothing. Then Nate pushed the glass away. Slow, deliberate. The glass slid across the bar and stopped against the rail, full. Let us go home, Nate said. Go home. They rode back together in the last light of the day, 2 figures on horseback against the fading sky. And when they came up the trail to the ranch, Abby was standing on the porch waiting. She watched them dismount, and she watched Jack head inside, and she looked at Nate standing in the yard with the reins in his hands and his hat pulled low. She understood what had almost happened. She understood what had not happened. She understood that Nathaniel Carson was not cured and might never be cured, but that today, on this day, he had chosen to come home. That was all any of them could do. He walked to the porch, stood at the bottom of the steps looking up at her. I do not like your plan, he said. I know. But you are right. We do not have another play. No, we do not. Then I have one condition. I will be in the back room of the store during the meeting, armed. If anything goes wrong, I am 30 feet away. Agreed. Abby. He said her name and nothing else, and in the way he said it, she heard everything the kitchen table conversation had left unfinished. The word he had almost spoken. The person he was afraid of losing. She reached down and took his hand. His fingers were rough and trembling, and they closed around hers with a grip that was almost desperate. "We are going to be all right," she said. "You do not know that." "No. But I am choosing to believe it anyway." The letter went to town the next morning with Margaret's husband on his weekly supply run. Dalton's response came back 2 days later, hand-delivered by Cole Braddock, who handed it to Abby at the ranch gate with an expression she could not read. One line written in elegant script on cream-colored paper. Thursday, 2:00. I will have the tea ready. Abby folded the note and looked at the cabin wall where she had been marking days. Not in the cabinet like Emily, on the wall, in plain sight, with charcoal. She had started doing it without thinking about it, counting the days since they arrived at the ranch. And she had not noticed until now that she was continuing Emily's work, counting days, counting hope, counting the distance between disaster and survival. Thursday was 3 days away. The baby was due in 2 weeks. She prayed it would wait. The baby came early, the way everything in Abigail's life came, without waiting for her to be ready. It started on a Wednesday afternoon, one day before the meeting with Dalton. Abby was in the garden salvaging what the fire had not destroyed when a pain ripped through her lower back and wrapped around her belly like a band of hot iron. She dropped the hoe and gripped the fence rail and breathed, and when the pain passed, she looked down and saw that her skirt was wet. "No," she whispered, "not yet." But the baby did not negotiate. The next contraction came 12 minutes later, and the next 8 minutes after that, and by the time she made it inside the cabin and sent Jack running for Margaret, the contractions were close enough that she knew this child was coming today, whether the world was ready or not. Margaret arrived within the hour, driving her wagon hard, with an older woman beside her. Ruth Coulter, the closest thing Bitter Creek had to a midwife. Ruth was 70 years old, with hands like leather, and a face that had seen everything at least twice and been surprised by none of it. "How far apart?" Ruth asked, rolling up her sleeves. 5 minutes, Abby managed between clenched teeth. Maybe less. Nate was banished to the porch. He went without argument, which told Abby more about his state of mind than any words could have. He was terrified. She could see it in the way his face had gone the color of old paper, and his hands had gripped the doorframe as if letting go would mean falling. Jack sat beside him on the porch steps. Emma stayed inside, positioning herself next to her mother's bed and taking Abby's hand without being asked. The girl said nothing. She did not need to. Her hand was small and steady, and it did not let go. The labor was hard. Harder than Jack's, harder than Emma's. The baby was turned wrong, coming feet first instead of head first, and Ruth's face went gray when she checked. "Breech," she said to Margaret, her voice low but not low enough. "We have got to turn it." The next hour was pain. There was no other word for it. Just pain, enormous and consuming, and Abby screamed in a way she had not known she was capable of, and the sound went through the cabin walls and out onto the porch where Nate sat with his hands gripping the railing until the wood groaned. He heard her scream, and he was back in another time. Another cabin. Another woman crying out in the dark. He could feel the past rising up through the floor like floodwater, filling his chest, closing his throat. Emily's voice. Emily's face. Emily reaching for the door. The cold bed. The empty house. No. He said it out loud, though no one was there to hear. He stood up. He walked to the cabin door. He put his hand on the latch. "You cannot go in there," Jack said. "Watch me." He opened the door. Margaret stepped in front of him, arms out, face furious. "Get out, Nathaniel. This is not a place for men." He walked past her. He crossed the cabin to where Abby lay on the bed, drenched in sweat, her face contorted, her hand gripping Emma's so hard the girl's fingers had gone white. He knelt beside her. He took her other hand, and he said the only thing he could think of. "Look at me. Do not look anywhere else. Look at me." She looked. Her eyes found his through the pain, through the fear, through the terrible aloneness of bringing life into the world with nothing but her own body and her own will. He held her gaze, and he did not flinch, and he did not look away, and he did not leave. He stayed. For the first time in the moment that mattered most, Nathaniel Carson stayed. Ruth turned the baby. It was not gentle. Abby screamed again, and her nails drew blood from Nate's palm, and he did not move. Then the baby turned, and Ruth said, "Push," and Abby pushed, and the baby came into the world screaming. A girl, small and red and furious and alive. Ruth cleaned her and wrapped her in the blanket Abby had sewn from the fabric Margaret had brought weeks ago. She placed the baby on Abby's chest, and Abby looked down at this small, wailing creature and felt the tears come, finally, after months of holding them back. They poured down her face, and she did not try to stop them because these tears were not grief. They were something else entirely. "What will you call her?" Margaret asked softly. Abby looked at Nate. He was still kneeling beside the bed, still holding her hand, his face raw with an emotion he had no name for. "Hope," Abby said. "Her name is Hope." Not because the world was good, not because things were going to be easy, but because hope was the one thing that could not be auctioned, could not be foreclosed, could not be burned or stolen or signed away in a contract. Hope. Born on a Wednesday afternoon in a leaning cabin in Wyoming Territory, to a woman who had nothing, and a man who had less, and already screaming at the world with lungs that would not quit. That evening, after Margaret and Ruth had gone, after the cabin had been cleaned, and the baby had been fed and the children were settled, Jack went out to the porch alone. He sat on the step and looked at the sky. The stars were thick overhead, more stars than he could count, each one cold and far away and burning. He was tired, not the tiredness that comes from work or from fear, but the deep, bone-level exhaustion of a boy who had been carrying a man's weight for too long. He was 10 years old, and he had been responsible for his mother and his sister for 4 months. That felt like 4 years, and every day he woke up and put on the armor of courage and wore it until his back ached, and every night he took it off and lay in the dark and shook. The cabin door opened. Nate came out and sat beside him. He did not speak. He was good at not speaking, Abby's cowboy. He could sit in silence the way most men could not sit still, letting the quiet do the work that words could not. "I am tired," Jack said. 2 words. Not an explanation, not a complaint, just the truth, stripped bare, and laid down between them on the porch step. Nate looked at him. In the starlight, the man's face was all planes and shadows, the jaw strong, the eyes deep-set and dark. He understood. Jack could see that he understood, not just the words, but everything behind them. Every night with the rifle, every morning with the brave face, every hour of being the man of the family when he was still, underneath everything, a boy who missed his father and was frightened of the world. "Then rest," Nate said. "I will keep watch." Jack's eyes closed. His head dropped against Nate's shoulder. And for the first time since his father died, Jack Thornton slept without guarding anything. Nate sat very still on that porch step with a boy leaning against his shoulder, and the stars wheeling overhead, and a newborn baby crying inside the cabin, and he thought about the word Abby had used when she slapped him on the burning roof. "Your son." Maybe, he thought. Maybe that is what this is. The meeting with Dalton was supposed to be Thursday. The baby came Wednesday. Abby could not go. Her body was wrecked, her mind was foggy with exhaustion, and Hope needed her every 2 hours. She sent Margaret instead. Same plan, same script, different face. Margaret would go to the store, meet Dalton, and negotiate on Abby's behalf. Margaret's husband would be behind the curtain. Everything else would proceed as planned. Margaret came back that evening with news. Dalton had come. He had sat at the store table and drunk his tea and smiled his patient smile and said everything they needed him to say. He admitted that Cornelius Whitfield had paid him $500, Margaret reported, sitting at the cabin table with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. He called it a finder's fee. Said your father wanted you returned to St. Louis for family reasons. Said he considered it a business transaction, nothing more. Did Henry hear it all? Nate asked. Every word. He wrote it down the moment Dalton left. Time, date, exact phrasing. It is all documented. Abby held Hope against her chest and felt the baby's heartbeat against her own. That is enough, she said. That is what we needed. But Margaret's face was grim. There is more. As I was leaving, Dalton stopped me at the door. He said to tell you he knows what we did and that it changes nothing. He said the law is on his side and by the end of the month he will have the ranch. Of course he said that, Abby replied, because he believes it. And until yesterday, he would have been right. What changed yesterday? Margaret asked. Abby looked at Nate. I had a baby, she said, and that baby is going to need a home. So I am done being patient, and I am done being careful, and I am done waiting for Frank Dalton to decide my future. We are going to take this to the territorial marshal. We are going to lay out everything we have. Dalton's confession, the forged documents, the arson, the debt auction system, all of it. And we are going to let the law, the real law, not Dalton's version, decide who is right. That night, as Abby nursed Hope in the lamplight, she heard hoofbeats approaching from the direction of town. Many hooves moving fast. Her heart stopped. She looked at Nate, who was already reaching for the rifle. Jack, she said, bar the windows. But the hoofbeats resolved into something unexpected. Not Dalton's men, not Cole and his gun hands. It was Margaret. And behind her, riding a tall gray horse with the bearing of a man who carried the law on his back, was a stranger in a long coat with a star pinned to his chest. Territorial Marshal James Pickett, out of Cheyenne. Margaret's husband had written to him 3 weeks ago. The letter had found him on the trail east of Casper. He had ridden straight through to Bitter Creek, 70 miles in 2 days, because the complaint described a pattern he had seen before in other counties. Debt auctions used as tools of land consolidation, forged documents, intimidation of settlers. He dismounted in the yard and tipped his hat to Abby, who stood in the doorway with a baby in her arms and fire in her eyes. Mrs. Carson, he said, I believe you have a story to tell me. I have more than a story, Marshal. I have evidence. Then let us talk. The Bitter Creek courthouse had never been so full and had never been so quiet as the morning Abigail Carson walked through its doors carrying a 2-week-old baby and 10 years of secrets. The building was not much. Clapboard walls, a plank floor, a judge's bench made from the same pine as the pews. But today it held every soul in the county who could ride, walk, or crawl to see what was about to happen. Ranchers who had lost land. Women who had been auctioned. Merchants who had paid Dalton's prices because they had no choice. They packed the benches and lined the walls and spilled out onto the steps, and they waited. Abby sat in the front row. Hope slept in Margaret's arms beside her. Jack sat on her left, straight-backed and solemn. Emma sat on her right, the calico cat somehow smuggled in under her coat. Nate stood behind her, one hand on the back of her chair, the other hanging loose at his side. His hands were still. For the first time in months, they were not trembling. The county magistrate, a weathered man named Harlan Crawford, sat behind the bench with Territorial Marshal Pickett beside him. Frank Dalton sat across the aisle with his lawyer, a thin man from Cheyenne who kept wiping his spectacles and looking at the crowd with the expression of a man who has realized he is standing on the wrong side of history. This is an administrative hearing, Crawford began, into the legality of the Bitter Creek debt auction system and the conduct of Frank Dalton in his capacity as the county's primary mortgage holder and creditor. Mrs. Carson, you have the floor. Abby stood. Her legs felt like water. Her heart was pounding so hard she was certain the entire room could hear it. She was not a lawyer. She was not a politician. She was a 29-year-old woman who had been sold on an auction block 2 months ago, and she was about to stand before a room full of people who had watched it happen and ask them to care. She walked to the front of the room and turned to face the crowd. "My name is Abigail Carson," she said. "Before that, it was Abigail Thornton. Before that, it was Abigail Whitfield. I have had 3 names in my life, and each one was a different kind of prison." She told them about the auction, not the dry facts, but the feeling of it. The heat of the planks under her feet, the laughter of 40 men looking at a pregnant woman and her children and seeing property instead of people. The sound of the auctioneer's hand across her face and the silence that followed. She told them about the debt system, how it worked on paper, clean and legal, a simple mechanism for settling public obligations, how it worked in practice, a machine for turning human desperation into cheap labor and cheaper land, operated by one man who had learned that the easiest way to own a town was to own its debts. She presented Margaret's written account of Dalton's confession, the $500 he had accepted from her father, the admission that he had been paid to locate and detain a free citizen without warrant or legal authority. Her voice shook. Her hands shook. She was not delivering a devastating legal argument. She was doing something harder. She was standing in a room full of people who had looked the other way and asking them to look at her. Just look. Just see. When she finished, she sat down and her hands would not stop trembling, and Nate's hand found her shoulder and steadied her. Then Cole Braddock stood up. The room went silent in a different way. Not the respectful silence of listening, but the electric silence of shock. Cole was sitting in the back row, his hat in his hands, his face the color of old ash. Dalton's lawyer half rose from his chair. Dalton himself turned and stared at his enforcer with an expression of dawning horror. "I would like to speak," Cole said. Crawford looked at Pickett. Pickett nodded. Cole walked to the front of the room. He stood where Abby had stood, and he looked at the floor, and he said the words that brought Frank Dalton's empire down. "3 weeks ago, Mr. Dalton ordered me to set fire to the Carson Ranch. He wanted the family driven off the land so he could claim the property under the mortgage default clause. I set the fire. I used kerosene. I placed the ignition point as far from the cabin as I could because there were children inside and I did not want them to burn. That does not make me innocent, but it makes him guilty." The courtroom erupted. Crawford banged his gavel. Dalton shot to his feet, shouting that Cole was a liar and a convict and his word meant nothing. The lawyer was pulling at Dalton's arm, trying to get him to sit down. And Dalton was shaking him off with the wild, cornered look of a man who has just realized that the ground has opened beneath his feet. "Order!" Crawford barked. "Sit down, Mr. Dalton, or I will have the marshal remove you." Dalton sat. But his face had changed. The patience was gone. The confidence was gone. In their place was something Abby recognized, because she had seen it in her own mirror for 10 years. Fear. Cole continued. He listed the things he had done under Dalton's direction. The forged documents, the intimidation of debtors, the harassment of ranchers who could not pay. He did not spare himself. He named his own crimes with the flat, matter-of-fact delivery of a man who has already accepted the consequences and wants only to be done with the telling. When he finished, Crawford was silent for a long time. Then the magistrate spoke. "Based on the testimony presented today and the evidence submitted by Mrs. Carson and Margaret Pritchard, this court finds the Bitter Creek debt auction system to be in violation of territorial statute. All existing labor contracts issued under this system are hereby nullified. The individuals subject to those contracts are free to go." He looked at Dalton. "Mr. Dalton, your conduct in this matter, including the acceptance of payment to detain a free citizen, the use of forged legal documents, and the ordering of arson against an occupied dwelling, will be referred to the territorial prosecutor in Cheyenne for criminal proceedings. Marshal Pickett, please take Mr. Dalton into custody." Pickett stood. Dalton stood. For one moment they faced each other across the courtroom, and then the marshal took Dalton's arm and Dalton went, because there was nowhere left to go. His lawyer followed, already calculating the defense. His assets, including the mortgage on Nate's ranch, were frozen pending the territorial investigation. The gavel came down once. The room exhaled. Cole Braddock walked out of the courthouse in Marshal Pickett's custody alongside Dalton. He would face trial at the territorial court in Cheyenne for arson. He would likely serve his time at the territorial prison in Laramie, the same prison where he had done 3 years for cattle theft. As he passed the front row, he stopped and looked at Emma. The girl was holding her cat and looking up at him with those solemn, knowing eyes. Cole nodded to her. Once. Then he walked on. Outside, the sun was blazing over Bitter Creek. The town looked the same as it had that morning. Same buildings, same dust, same sky. But something had shifted underneath, the way the ground shifts after a quake, imperceptible until you notice that the cracks are in different places. Margaret started clapping. She stood on the courthouse steps and brought her hands together, slow and steady. And after a moment, someone joined her, and then someone else. And then the sound spread through the crowd like a wave. Not cheering, not celebration, just acknowledgement. The recognition that something had changed and that the changing had cost something, and that the cost had been worth it. Nate found Abby on the steps. She was holding Hope, who had slept through the entire hearing with the oblivious peace of a 2-week-old baby. He looked at her, and she looked at him. And for a moment neither of them could speak because words were too small for what was filling the space between them. He reached out and took Hope from her arms. He held the baby against his chest, carefully, the way you hold something you are afraid of breaking. And Abby watched this man, who could not sleep in his own cabin, hold a newborn like she was the most precious thing in the world. "She is hungry," Abby said. "She is always hungry. She gets that from you." Something happened to Nate's face then. The hard lines softened, the tension around his jaw released, and he smiled. Not the flickering, half-formed expressions she had seen before. A real smile, full and warm, the kind that changes a face completely and makes you realize you have never actually seen it until now. Jack stood on the top step, looking out at the town. He could see his mother talking with the marshal. He could see Nate holding Hope. He could see Emma sitting on the bottom step with the cat in her lap. And she was making a sound. Not words. Humming. A tuneless, wandering melody that had no beginning and no end. But it was sound, voluntary sound, the first music she had made in a year. Jack thought about the rifle behind the cabin door. He thought about the trigger under his finger and the choice he had made not to pull it. He thought about sleeping on Nate's shoulder and the sound of someone saying, "Rest. I will keep watch." Maybe this is what family feels like, he thought. Not safe all the time, but never alone. They loaded the wagon and drove home. Nate held the reins. Abby sat beside him. Jack and Emma in the back with Hope between them, wrapped in her blanket, blinking at the enormous sky. At the top of the ridge, Nate stopped the wagon. Below them, the ranch spread out in the afternoon light. The cabin still listing east, the pasture still half black from the fire, the chicken coop still a pile of charred lumber. "Nothing has changed," Nate said. "Everything has changed," Abby answered. He looked at her. She looked at him. And the space between them, which had started as suspicion and become utility, and then become something fragile and unnamed, was suddenly not a space at all. It was a bridge, and they were both standing on it, and neither of them was going to be the first to walk away. On the way down the hill, Nate glanced toward the small rise behind the barn where Emily's cross stood white against the green grass. He did not stop. Abby saw him look and asked quietly, "Do you want to go up?" He shook his head. "Do not need to. She knows." He drove on. When they reached the cabin, Emma jumped down from the wagon before it had fully stopped and ran inside. Abby followed, expecting the girl to head for her pallet or the cat's basket. Instead, Emma was standing by the cold fireplace. She turned and looked at her mother, and her eyes were clear and steady and full of something that Abby had not seen in them for a very long time. Purpose. "Can I light the fire?" Emma said. A full sentence, 7 syllables, clear and strong and certain. Abby nodded, because she did not trust her voice. Emma knelt by the hearth and arranged the kindling the way Abby had taught her. Small sticks first, then larger ones, the tinder nest in the center. She struck the match and held it to the tinder and blew gently, and the flame caught and the fire grew, and the cabin filled with warmth and light and the crackle of wood finding its voice. A child lighting a fire, the simplest thing in the world, and the most profound. Because this child had been silent for months, sealed inside a grief too large for her small body, and now she was speaking and building and making warmth, and that meant she was home. Not just in a place, in herself. Nate carried the horses to the barn to unsaddle them. He hung the harness on its pegs and wiped down the animals and filled their feed buckets. And then he stood in the barn and looked at the shelf above his cot. The bottle of rye was there, where it always was, where it had been since the day he bought it 2 years ago, and decided that the measure of his strength would not be avoiding temptation, but surviving it. He picked it up, felt its weight in his hand. The glass was cool and smooth and familiar, and inside the amber liquid caught the light from the open barn door and glowed like honey. He thought about Emily's tally marks, about the longest row, 47 days, and all the short rows that followed. He thought about the saloon, the full glass on the bar, Jack sitting beside him in silence. He thought about Abby's hand in his, and the words she had shouted on the burning roof. Your son. He uncorked the bottle, tipped it over, and poured it into the dirt. No ceremony, no declaration, no grand gesture. Just a man emptying a bottle because he did not need it anymore. The whiskey soaked into the barn floor and disappeared, and the smell of it rose once, sharp and sweet, and then faded into the hay and dust and horse smell of a working barn. He set the empty bottle on the shelf. Maybe he would throw it away tomorrow. Maybe he would keep it as a reminder. It did not matter. The bottle was empty, and he was not, and that was enough. He walked back to the cabin. Abby was standing in the doorway, framed by the warm light of Emma's fire. Hope was in her arms, awake now, making the small, insistent sounds of a baby who wanted the world to know she was here. Jack was at the table, setting out the tin plates for supper. Emma was by the hearth, feeding sticks to her fire with the careful attention of a girl who has discovered that she can make light. Abby looked at the world that Nathaniel Carson's $20 had built. The leaning cabin and the scorched pasture, and the chickens they did not have yet, and the man walking toward her with scarred wrists and steady hands and eyes the color of rain. It was not perfect. It would never be perfect. There would be hard winters and short money, and nights when Nate stared at nothing, and mornings when Abby woke with her father's voice in her head telling her to run. But the fire was lit. The children were inside, and for the first time in 10 years, she was not running toward anything or away from anything. She was home. Nate stepped onto the porch. He stopped in front of her close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes and the ash still caught in his hair, and the way his mouth curved when he was trying not to smile and failing. You told me I would regret it, he said. That first day, I remember. You were wrong. He kissed her. Not on the forehead. Not gently. Not like a man paying respects or fulfilling an obligation. He kissed her like a man who had decided to be alive again, and she kissed him back like a woman who had finally stopped running. And behind them in the cabin, Jack said, "Ugh," and Emma laughed, actually laughed, a sound like water over stones. And Hope began to cry, because that is what babies do when the world gets loud with living. Nate pulled back and looked at her. His eyes were gray as the Wyoming sky before rain, and just as full. "Come inside," Abby said. "Supper is getting cold." He followed her in and closed the door. Outside, the prairie stretched to the horizon in every direction, vast and wild and indifferent to the small, warm light glowing in the window of a cabin that leaned slightly east. The wind blew through the grass the way it always had, making its endless whispering sound, carrying the smell of sage and smoke, and the last heat of a day that had changed everything. Somewhere in the foothills, a coyote howled, and this time from across the valley, another answered back. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.